Welcome to the Capital Forum's antitrust interview series sponsored by Kroll On Track. My name is Ben Unglesby. I'm here with Seth Bloom, president and founder of Bloom Strategic Counsel, Washington, D.C. Law firm specializing in public policy, government relations, and antitrust analysis. And he previously served as general counsel of the U.S. Senate Antitrust Committee for nearly 14 years. Thank you for coming.
Thank you
Seth.
for inviting me.
We can start out talking about what everyone else is talking about in this town these days, the U.S. presidential primary. We've narrowed down the field of candidates a little bit. Maybe we can go through them and see what antitrust enforcement looks like under each one. So the one everyone is talking about the most. Let's start with Donald Trump.
Thank you for giving me the most unpredictable one, and he certainly is. But I guess maybe just before starting on particulars, one interesting thing about this year, this presidential election year, I think is very unusual, maybe since the time of Teddy Roosevelt, is that it seems like, if not, they don't use the word antitrust, but they talk about concentration and consolidation. It seems like the issues that animate antitrust are really part of the presidential election, particularly when we think of Bernie Sanders, and also, but I think when we think of Donald Trump, I think there's sort of a populism, and it's sort of unique. So at least for presidential elections of the last few decades, when antitrust wasn't even really thought of. So, not having said that, none of these candidates has really developed an specific antitrust agenda. If turning specifically, if you turn to Donald Trump, I think he's a complete wild card. I mean, on the one hand, he talks about how he can make deals, and how how the middle class is getting harmed, and I think he would generally say he doesn't like too big corporate power. But on the other hand, it's clear he hasn't given really much thought to antitrust. And so but he's probably the rare presidential candidate that actually was an antitrust plaintiff. For anybody who remembers the United States Football League, he filed an antitrust suit against the United States Football League, or against the NFL, I'm sorry, and
what was behind it?
Well, that there was some monopolistic behavior and preventing him, for example, from accessing stadiums so they could
I was going to say, it had to have something to do with Donald Trump.
It's interesting, he won that case, but he won a jury verdict of $1, which was trebled to $3. So it was very much a Pyrrhic victory. But at least he somewhat, I'm sure he remembers this, he was an antitrust plaintiff. I think, it's really almost uncertain what we would know would happen with Donald Trump and antitrust if he were to come to office.
Could we take him at his word that he would go after Amazon and Jeff Bezos, or is even that?
I mean, I think that's rhetoric.
Yeah.
I think that, I don't think we can. And, but I mean, I will make a prediction, who knows who sees this video, but I think it's fairly unlikely that we'll see a Trump presidency. But, some people watching this 6 months from now might find out differently, and then I'll wish I hadn't said that. But
well, you also brought up Bernie Sanders.
Yes.
So
I mean, Bernie Sanders is, you would think would take a very hard line in antitrust. Very much opposed to corporate consolidation. One would think that he would appoint antitrust officials who would give any merger of any size a particular hard time. So for those, who are seeking vigorous antitrust enforcement, then you would expect to see that with Bernie Sanders, no question about it. The one thing, of course, however vigorously he wanted to enforce the antitrust laws, it's ultimately the courts that get to decide whether or not an antitrust violation has been made. But I think it would cause companies to think twice about engaging in merger transactions if Bernie Sanders was the president and was appointing the head of the antitrust
division. We can at least
division.
expect to see more in court.
Yeah, we could expect more challenges, which itself would deter people from filing antitrust cases.
Hillary Clinton.
I think Hillary, we would expect a lot of continuity. She's, I would expect the kind of figures that we've seen appointed, are very well-respected antitrust folks who are, now in the private sector. For example, someone like Bill Baer. I would expect to see an official like that appointed ahead of the antitrust division, or someone like Edith Ramirez, who's the chairwoman of the FTC. I would expect a lot of continuity. I don't think she has a particular agenda in antitrust to change things. I mean, she believes in antitrust enforcement, there's no question about it, but it's not like she would like to see radical change, as I'm sure that Bernie Sanders would like to see.
Ted Cruz.
So, Ted Cruz is an interesting figure because he was at the FTC. And, he comes from a very conservative background, and you might think he's skeptical of government intervention in private markets. But on the other hand, he wasn't a senior FTC official. And so I think from that experience, he probably does respect antitrust enforcement. I'm unaware of his specific policy prescriptions for antitrust. I think, we would see in Ted Cruz, maybe similar to George W. Bush, similar to former Chairman Muris of the FTC, who appointed him to his position, a sort of a solid, a restrained antitrust enforcement, but I wouldn't say he would abandon the whole antitrust enterprise.
Should we mention Kasich?
I mean, again, it's another one I think is sort of unlikely, but to become president. I mean, he's a centrist figure.
Yeah.
You would expect him to appoint centrist antitrust officials, and probably he's not as much to the right as Ted Cruz. So again, I think if John Kasich were to be elected president, I think you would see a lot of continuity with the way that antitrust is enforced today.
Right. Well, moving to another branch of government, on the Hill, we've heard some rumblings about antitrust lately. There's been hearings where, specifically the Senate Antitrust Committee or Subcommittee has asked some tough questions of federal regulators. What do you make of it? Is this a big political shift? Or is there renewed attention to antitrust issues at the Senate level?
No, this is a very interesting question that you raised, and I know Capitol Forum has recently done a story on this and highlighting what's happened. We've seen 2 hearings in the last 3 weeks, and for anybody watching this, today's April 7th of 2016. So in the last month, we've seen 2 hearings. One both in the Senate Antitrust Subcommittee, one in general oversight hearing, where it was then AAG Bill Baer and Chairwoman Edith Ramirez of the FTC testified, and then we saw just a few days ago, again as I speak, a hearing in the Antitrust Subcommittee about Section 5 of the FTC and whether the FTC went too far. And the interesting thing, well, particularly in the first hearing, in the oversight hearing, on both sides of the aisle, there was considerable support for aggressive antitrust enforcement, including from some conservative Republicans, such as Senator Hatch and Senator Grassley, Chairman of the Judiciary Committee, Grassley. I think Senator Hatch was notable for really questioning the FTC about whether or not it had properly investigated Google and questioning why they closed the investigation in 2013, early 2013. But of course, we also saw a very strong statement from Senator Blumenthal in particular, in addition to Senator Franken, but Senator Blumenthal in particular, saying basically merger review had failed, and calling for much more heavy scrutiny of mergers by both the Justice Department and the FTC. In this recent hearing, we saw Senator Blumenthal return to the question of whether the FTC acted improperly or mistakenly, I should say, not improperly, but mistakenly in closing the investigation of Google in 2013. And Tim Wu, who's now in the New York Attorney General's office, a professor at Columbia who has been at the FTC, he questioned him quite vigorously about whether or not the FTC should reopen that investigation, and Tim Wu expressed support that they should. But getting more generally, there were a lot of across-the-board statements of vigorous antitrust enforcement, as I say, including from the Republican side of the aisle. Now, the question is that represent a break, something significant? I mean, see, I remember from my time when I was on the staff of the Antitrust Subcommittee in the 2000s and the beginning of the 2010s, we also had oversight hearings, and we also called for vigorous antitrust enforcement, and we would list sort of cases that we thought there could be more enforcement. So in my mind, as a former staffer, I didn't find anything that remarkable, other than I was glad to see, as someone who believes in antitrust, that there's a continued emphasis on antitrust enforcement. Maybe it's a little stronger, but I don't think it's a radical break. Also, Senator Blumenthal himself is still relatively new to the Senate. He was elected in 2010, so he firmed office in 2011. So, for most of my time there, we didn't have a voice like Senator Blumenthal, who was a state attorney general in Connecticut and brought a number of antitrust cases, participated in the antitrust case against Microsoft in the late 90s, early 2000s. So he's always been a voice for vigorous antitrust enforcement. I think his addition to the panel may have sort of skewed it from what it might have been in before. But, it's clear that I think the lesson we can take and future enforcers could take is that both sides of the aisle right now believe strongly in strong antitrust enforcement, and this may be a reflection of what I said, sort of the populism that's emerging that we've seen in the presidential election campaign. And they're responding to that, and their constituents expressing concerns about all these mergers and corporate consolidation, and are the antitrust laws being enforced?
And so we see discussion of it on the presidential campaign. We see it in the Senate. We see the thread of populism in the presidential campaign, some bipartisan support for antitrust enforcement, across the board. Does it matter? Is it going to change what the enforcers do?
Well, I think to a large extent, there's a lot, as I use the word I used before, there's a lot of continuity in antitrust enforcement. Yeah. There's been sort of significant roadblocks had been put up in the last decade or so by the Supreme Court about what can constitute an antitrust case, particularly not in merger cases, but in monopolization cases, cases brought under Section 2 of the Sherman Act. Also, with respect to private cases, what it's necessary to prove an antitrust case, cases such as Twombly, Trinco. And so whoever is enforcing antitrust law is going to have to deal with that judicial precedent. Right. Having said that, I think it does make a difference. It makes a difference in terms of the types of people that get nominated to fill these jobs and their sense that they need to be aggressive. I think we've already seen it make a difference, I think. At both the DOJ and the FTC, the number of merger challenges they've brought. Just yesterday as we sit here, the Justice Department brought a case against Halliburton, right. The Halliburton-Baker Hughes merger. The Staples Office Depot merger is being litigated in federal court right now. And we see in Cisco U.S. Foods. We've seen a whole series of antitrust cases that have been brought in recent years, which were not slam dunk cases. Right. I think in the merger enforcement area, we've already seen, I think, a change to stronger antitrust enforcement. In the non-merger area, in the non-merger civil area, with these monopolization cases, we haven't seen that. Yeah. And I think that's the big question. There really hasn't, at the FTC, been a major monopolization case brought in years. I mean, I can't think of one. Yeah. And at the Justice Department, not very many. So that'll be an interesting area to see if that changes.
Yeah. Of the mergers being looked at by enforcers or being litigated, are there any you find particularly interesting for their political implications or political context?
The ones being litigated. Most of the ones that are being litigated right now, I think, are not particularly political, such as Staples Office Depot or the case just filed against Halliburton, Baker Hughes. We've seen one that's the investigation is just beginning as we speak, is the announcement this week of the merger between Alaska Airlines and Virgin. Of course, the airline area has seen a lot of consolidation, and it's an issue that gets a lot of political heat. Senator Blumenthal, at that hearing I discussed, the oversight hearing, was very concerned about consolidation in the airline industry. Bill Baer, the Assistant Attorney General for Antitrust, who just stepped down from that position, expressed concern about it as well.
So do you think that'll have an impact on the way the...
It might. Now, you sort of ordinary antitrust principles would say, if we're looking at Alaska and Virgin, there's very few overlapping routes, and traditionally the way that antitrust analysis in the airline industry is, you basically look at the route structure and where they overlap. Ordinary antitrust analysis would say this one, there's not really strong reasons to block it or to take action against it. The question is sort of what some people have called systems competition, is you're losing, two of the competitive airlines to the sort of the big four, and is that going to make it easier for the airlines to coordinate, or is that going to make it easier for them to raise ancillary fees like baggage fees and change fees? Are they going to be concerned about issues like that go beyond just route competition? The complaint that the Justice Department initially brought against U.S. Airways and American back in 2013 alleged all kinds of things like this. In addition to alleging a thousand routes, so you see, we can see the number of routes, I think, is about 6 in the case of Virgin and Alaska, but they alleged 1,000 routes in which competition was going to be, in their view, harmed. But when they sort of essentially abandoned that complaint, when they settled that case, for what was essentially a slap on the wrist, very light remedy. So they really didn't go beyond sort of, when you look at the settlement as opposed to what they put in their complaint, they really didn't go beyond the traditional way that airline cases have been analyzed. The question is, with this one, will they go beyond? And your question was about the political, and the reason I bring this case up is, as I said before, airline mergers attract a lot of political scrutiny and a lot of political concerns.
So everybody flies.
Everybody flies.
Everyone's annoyed by flying.
Exactly, including the members who have to fly to their home districts, so the members of Congress. So yeah, and it's sort of a big hot button issue. So I would not be surprised at all to see that that merger gets extra scrutiny from what you would not expect just because of the political factors that play here.
And you had brought up Google and the discussion of Google
Right.
at the antitrust subcommittee.
Yeah.
And last time we spoke with you
Yeah.
at the previous
Which was about a year ago,
spring meeting,
April 2015, right?
we talked about
Right,
Google.
that's right.
And that was pretty close to when the Wall Street Journal.
Yes,
story
I think it might have. It was either just before or just after.
Right.
I think it might have been just after, but I'm not sure.
And since then, we've seen there's been even more heat on Google
Yes.
with some U.S. state attorney generals are
Right.
calling for what more
Well,
investigation.
there was a letter from the state attorneys general of Utah, not known as a radically liberal place,
Right.
and also the state attorney general of the District of Columbia sent to the chairwoman of the FTC, basically saying he should reopen this case, and there's been serious allegations. There's been a lot of scrutiny, and I think deservedly so. I mean, we've had a number of events last year. We had the FTC inadvertently releasing its report, which revealed the staff felt that Google was behaving in a monopolistic way and was preferencing its own results, downgrading its competitors' results, resulting in a degraded search product, which Google said, what we're doing here is to help consumers. And what the FTC final closing statement of the commissioner said is, the reason we're closing it is this is beneficial to consumers. Well, the staff report that came out 6 months earlier, that didn't come out, but was written 6 months earlier, said in fact they weren't benefiting consumers, they were degrading the consumer experience. That report just came out last April. Then we had the European Commission filing a complaint against Google for comparison shopping, a statement of objections alleging that Google was behaving in a monopolistic way. Then we saw really, I think, what was a groundbreaking economic study by Professor Wu and Professor Luca of the Harvard Business School, Professor Liu, who was at Columbia, which found that the way that Google was doing its searches with respect to local searches for local businesses, was in a way it was sort of favoring its own properties. Consumers didn't prefer that. It was an inferior product to a truly unbiased search result. And that because consumers preferred the unbiased, that shows, in my mind, real consumer harm. I think all these developments, again, the Attorney General letters, show that this issue is not at all over. We also have questions about Android and whether Google is behaving in an anti-competitive manner with respect to the Android operating system for mobile devices. Something else the European Commission said it's going to look at. I think there's a lot more to be said about that. And particularly, I think if we see, which we will see, when we see new antitrust enforcers with the new administration, they're not going to be defensive. I think there's a little bit of a sense at the FTC that they sort of have to defend their decision in 2013. But I would expect most of the folks by January of next year, most of the folks who were responsible for that decision at the political level will be gone. So I think it definitely bears close monitoring. And also, and I should have said, and I mentioned it earlier, the interest that Senator Blumenthal and others on the antitrust subcommittee have expressed in this issue also shows that the issue is not dead. And they're really, Senator Blumenthal essentially is calling for a new inquiry into this. And I think that's important.
Finally, the FTC, we lost a commissioner.
We did.
We have fewer people making decisions. Is that going to affect ultimate outcomes?
I don't know that it affects outcomes. Before we lost Commissioner Brill, who you're referring to, it was a 3-to-1 Democratic commission. Now it's a 2-to-1 Democratic commission. It takes a majority to take action at the FTC, and just the majority of the existing commissioners. So two will do. So I don't think it really changes the balance in the FTC. And most of the heavy lifting of investigating cases is not done by the commissioners, they're the decision makers, but it's done by the staff.
But we saw with Google that it makes a difference.
Well, that's a very good point. You're right about that. And I think with Google, it's possible that could change how they look at it. But maybe making a more general point, I think it'll, the FTC this year will continue as it's been doing before. I would be very surprised, it's not impossible, but if we have 2 vacancies, because we already had a vacancy for a Republican commissioner after Commissioner Wright left, I would be surprised if those vacancies get filled this year just because of the difficulty of confirming.
I was going to say, I'd be surprised if any.
Right, that's right. So basically, I think realistically, likely, we're going to have 3 commissioners for the remainder of 2016. So that is a question, and I don't know the history of the FTC they've ever had. They've had it occasionally for a short time, or they've had it for an extended period of time. 3 commissioners. I'm unaware that that's happened. So it's something that bears watching. But I think because so much of the work of the day-to-day work of the commission is done at the bureau level and by the Bureau of Competition and antitrust issues, I don't think it's really going to affect them in a large way this year.
Well, Seth, thank you so much for joining us.
I very much enjoyed it. Thank you for the invitation.
Great.